Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this live from the studio with North Shore Award winner Matilda Aslizadeh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Fauni Barra, and I am the Public Programs and Residency Coordinator here at Griffin Art Projects. And before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolen nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. As well, we would like to thank the North Vancouver Rec and Culture, BC Arts Council, as well as the Privy Foundation for their continuing support of the residency program. And yeah, without further ado, I will introduce to you the winner of the North Shore Studio Award, Matilda Aslizadeh. So Matilda Aslizadeh media installations and photo-based works are characterized by dense visual surfaces and unexpected juxtapositions drawn from a range of photographic, cinematic, and painterly influences. Deeply invested in exploring the critical potential of immersing spectacle, the ambivalent centrality of storytelling in human existence, and the fluid threshold between documentation and fictionalization, Aslizadeh's work locates political thinking firmly within affective experience. Her work has been exhibited internationally in galleries and festivals, including exhibitions at the Vancouver Art Gallery, the AC Institute in New York, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Toronto. And now we'll hear from her.
Hello, thank you, Fauni. And first, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And of course, Griffin Art Projects for their generous support. And I'm really excited to share a little bit what I've been working on in my time here. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and please let me know if there are any issues with accessing or seeing.
We are seeing it. All good.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll just do a really quick intro to sort of, a little bit like the kind of formal and conceptual themes that recur in my work. Formally, I'm really interested in a kind of in a very layered aesthetic. Typically, I will kind of use a lot of found footage, but also shoot actors against a green screen, and then do some animation that sort of adds also to the ambience. So they're very layered works, and part of that layered aesthetic has to do with how I think about the complexity of contemporary relations and trying to see contemporary life through this sort of multiple lens at the same time. So kind of interaction between multiplicity and simultaneity. So all these different perspectives that are compressed in one view. And second point, in terms of my formal aesthetic, there's usually a kind of sculptural element to my video installation. So very heavily layered videos with a sculptural element. In terms of concepts, I'm really interested in the ideological aspect of built environments. So these sort of environments that we inhabit very frequently have these embedded ideologies, and I like to sort of use exaggeration and hyperbole to dig out the strands of these kinds of ideological implications that are built into our the spaces that we inhabit. And on top of that, I'm really interested in thinking about these ideological concepts and philosophical complex concepts and exploring them through narrative. So while my works have a kind of sort of conceptual philosophical element to them, so for example, in this work, Resort, I was really interested in thinking about how in Western culture, space and designations of space and boundaries are used to mark spaces of violence versus spaces of prosperity, for example. So while there's this philosophical element, I like to explore those philosophical elements through a narrative lens, so through storytelling. And with this Here's another still that kind of talks about like the architectural or sculptural element. So going back to storytelling, I do like to sort of have a combination between the conceptual and the narrative. And so when I'm pulling from the conceptual, I'm usually operating in a more visual arts context. When I'm pulling from the narrative, I'm kind of operating in a film or cinematic context. And a lot of my work has been about like pushing these two models of visual culture together. So moving on from that, I want to talk about the project that's been sort of occupying me for many years now and that I've been working on quite intensely over here at Griffin Art Projects. And that's a project called Possession, and it's also a video installation. So kind of tapping back into this idea of film. Often when people are pitching a film for funding or for further development, they come up with a premise, right? And a premise that sort of encapsulates the story and sort of most interesting aspect of the piece. And so for me, the premise I came up with later, but I mean, the concept was there, but framing it in this particular way was something I did after I started to do more and more research into more traditional narrative models and filmmaking and traditional script writing. So my premise for this project is, what if? And a premise usually begins with this what if. What if the neoliberal economy was the villain in a horror film? So for me and this project, I was really interested in using the genre of horror, but using it to explore the idea of the economy and how it functions post 1980s and post a lot of the sort of social welfare structures that were put in after World War II and how and when they began to be dismantled following the late 70s and early 80s. So this is what I mean when I talk about the neoliberal economy. It's an economy that's driven primarily by investment, primarily by market values, and primarily by shareholders and the stake of shareholders. So people who invest in a particular company as opposed to the stakeholders, which would not only have to do with the people who invest in a particular company, but you know, the employees, the environment, the community, all that stuff. So this movement from a stakeholder model to a shareholder model. But again, kind of mixing it up with this idea of horror and the genre of horror. So, moving on from there. So more specifically, this whole project came up about when I encountered this essentially a ghost town online. So and usually my projects will sort of begin this way. I kind of find something that intrigues me and I do more and more research into it. So the town I'm talking about is called Kitsault. So it's a historic place. It still exists. It's in northern BC, quite close to Terrace, and periodically it'll pop up in the news. And it's a community that was built for the families and employees of folks that were up there to mine a certain element called molybdenum. So it's a mining town essentially. And it was built in right at this moment that I'm interested in, that I already mentioned, this moment where these economic policies in Western democracies moved from being more welfare state oriented to more neoliberal, more market driven. So it was a place that was built to support these miners, but the interesting thing about it is that because of the volatility of the market, especially in the early 80s, the value of molybdenum, the thing they were mining there, collapsed. So the entire company was shut down. So it kind of, this space reiterates this boom and bust cycle that's there with a lot of our resource towns. A lot of these towns that were, you know, that the entire economy is based around extraction, but it happened so quickly here. So basically they built the town and within 18 months, the price had crashed and everybody had to be evacuated. So long story short, it sort of is there as a weird time capsule of this moment because it's both old, but it's not very much used. So it's sort of this uncanny space where everything is the way it was in the early 80s. And it's still been preserved. So the company and various different owners have an investment in preserving the space, and the electricity runs, and you can still visit the space, although it's a little bit hard to access it. So three things that interested me about the space is I'll just kind of go back here. Is this kind of how it shows this accelerated boom and bust cycle that I'm interested in. And then this idea of this uncanniness of the space. So it's simultaneously old and new. It's been, it's old because it was built a long time ago, but it hasn't been used. So there's this weird sort of unworn quality about it. And then finally, yes, of course, also this interest in ideological spaces too that I talked about. So this was a kind of planned utopian community, so around resource extraction. And then finally, I was really interested in just the tactility of the space, the materials, and I felt a kind of nostalgic feeling when I first saw these images, because they sort of resonated with the earliest memories I have of Vancouver, of North America, when I arrived here as a 6-year-old immigrant. So there was something really nostalgic about just the materiality of this space and the fact that, of course, it looks new. So there was a weird kind of personal resonance for me as well. And the project is heavily invested in sort of all these material layers, and in both the way I shot the film, but also the way it's going to be exhibited. So this was the inspiration of the project, and this is a historical, so I'm calling this the historical Kitsault. So the historical Kitsault is different from how this town eventually came to exist in my project and my film. So there is a connection to this historical town, but I want to clarify that as I started to work on it, it really became a kind of just a starting point, and that the piece itself is much has shifted. So that the sort of actual town and the work is not identical with this historical town. So that's a little bit about the inspiration. So now I'll jump to talking about the genre of horror and how I hope to bring that into this piece. So the town in my work is an unnamed fictional town. It's in North America, but it can actually really stand in for any site of resource extraction in North America. But at the same time, it does follow the same trajectory of the historic town. So it is built from scratch. All these families move in, and then within a short time, it's evacuated. So it goes back to the historic town. And then the horror element. So while I'm really invested in the horror element being sort of this nameless entity, which ends up being the economy as opposed to a specific agent, I did model the horror element off a lot of films in the 1970s that are sometimes called feminist horror films, but they were made by men, and we can kind of say that maybe they're actually dealing with the anxieties of men around what was going on in the 1970s with women's roles. So a prime example of these movies is the Stepford Wives, which some of you may be familiar, and I can absolutely talk about it a little bit more in questions. So along with the sort of time of 79, 80, late 70s to early 80s in terms of the narrative of the town itself, I'm also really interested in the cultural production of the time around horror films, and horror films that had a kind of social understory, shall we say. But to kind of go to the final quote down here, again, although with horror stories, typically, even if they have a social element, as many contemporary horror films do, even though they are kind of a metaphor or an analogy of social relations, there's always a kind of supernatural entity that is at fault, or a human entity. There are these different models of evil agency, and I was really interested in that evil agent within the horror film being something quite boring, which is just capital and the economy and the market-driven economy, the market, essentially. So there's a kind of flippage that happens there. So with the project, there are multiple levels to it. So, and it took me, like, I worked it out through different stages. And one of the stages was first working out the installation. So I was really interested with this project to push that sculptural element in my work, and that multi-layered aesthetic that I was talking about earlier. I wanted part of that multi-layeredness to actually be within a built environment. So not only is the video itself layered, but the video itself is layered with these material sculptural sets that are then layered on against each other in a sense. So I generated this idea of a kind of film set that looks like the reference photos that I have of the town itself. So the stories of the town will be actually projected into a kind of mini set that sort of touches on the main pieces or main architectural elements that remain in the historical town of Kitsault. So there's the mall, there's the apartment buildings, there's the residences, and those will all be sort of physically built in this set. And the set ideally will be 2/3 scale, so not fully, not like full scale, but also not a miniature, so that there's also something kind of uncanny about the relationship of the body to the set too, where it's kind of big enough to inhabit, but not quite big enough. So I want the piece to evoke something like a museum exhibit. So if you've ever seen any interactive museum exhibits that try to recreate the experience of being in a particular place and time. So something between a museum exhibit and a theme park attraction. So in the end, the viewer will be totally immersed in this set and see different elements of the story play out across different sets at the same time. So I'm thinking about the viewer as a kind of final editor of the piece. So as the person walks around and interacts with different elements of the set, they will kind of have access to different elements of the story. So, and then it is once again very complex, and that complexity for me has to do with the complexity of just getting a complete picture of historical causality. So really digging into some of the ideas that were, I guess, brought to my attention, having researched the actual historical town. And it is a very kind of complex and layered history, and I want that complexity and a layered element to be reflected in the complexity of the installation. Oops. Hitting the wrong thing. So here are some more elements about it that are a little bit more about the installation itself. So in the end, I kind of broke it down to 6 screens. So this is a little bit how my process works, is that I kind of decided the set is going to look like this, and there's going to be all these different screens. So in the end, I kind of broke it down to 6 screens. And once I knew that these 6 screens would be running at the same time, then I began to storyboard and create my story and script write. So this is a little shot of my storyboard, and the way it worked, I had to kind of develop a new template, storyboard template, because I had to know not only how things were sort of going forward in time. So a typical storyboard would, show you shot 1, shot 2, etc. But so I had to know how they were going forward in time, but I also had to know how they were going forward spatially. So how is the shot change in one screen going to impact the other, and everything was very carefully synced because I did in the end want to evoke a kind of story that is comparable to a classical narrative story. So it's a blend of kind of classical narrative cinematic techniques, but also this kind of splitting apart, which is more experimental or avant-garde. So here's a little visualization I did of how the set and the images would work together. And so the set is the sort of stuff that looks more illustration, and then the projections are the photographic elements. So those are just shots from the town itself, but just to give you an idea of how projected image and material set will interact with each other in the final piece. Forward one more time. So once I did come up with the set and storyboard and script write and everything, I was ready to shoot. And so the production on this happened a couple of summers ago, and it was quite a big shoot. And so the actual production element is done, and right now I'm working on the post-production, so editing, effects, etc. So here are some stills from the production itself, which was quite a large one for me, and so these are kind of examples of the types of imagery, the video elements that will be kind of embedded in that set. And now the process that I'm almost done here at Griffin has to do with how I'm editing these together. So now I'm kind of recreating my storyboard in video form, where I'm putting the shots together and then also kind of timing them up against different shots to get my final cut ready. And then once the final cut's done, I will add sounds, effects, everything, and then re-spatialize it in terms of projecting all these different images onto different components of the set. So in terms of those effects, so everywhere that you see greens and blues in this work, there will be effects in there and different elements. And a lot of those will have to do with actually recreating a CGI version of the actual town, or not the actual town, but the town in my imagination that's inspired by the actual town, in terms of the landscape. And what will always dominate the landscape is this big open pit mine, and the architecture. So the architecture will be this sort of modular house that will be, in the images, in the film itself, but also be recreated in the set. So you'll have this kind of weird mirroring of kind of facades that are in the set and facades that are in the film, and the actors are interacting with those facades in the film. I'm going to see how we are doing. Well, okay, so just to sort of see how much I want to delve into the background of it, I will talk a little bit more about, I guess, this historical moment. So this historical moment of 1971 to 1979 to 1981, which is roughly when the film is set, when the historical town was created and inhabited, and has become this sort of site of exploration for me. That unpacks all these layered meanings that I was referring to. So I want to maybe give you a sense of what these layered meanings are and why I'm interested in this moment. So I'm interested in this moment for, I guess, a bunch of both abstract and cultural points, but also very specific historical points. And some of those historical points are more local and some more global. So I'm interested in this moment because of this, what I've already talked about, this sort of shift in economic policies, but also this moment sees the sort of final decade of the USSR and this kind of world order that then was to collapse. And now we can argue is weirdly trying to resurrect itself, or the echoes of that moment are sort of coming back. But also there was the Islamic Revolution and this sort of another political upheaval that was very much connected to extraction and resources. And then on a cultural level, by the 70s, you had the late 70s, early 80s, you had this kind of co-option and repackaging of feminism by capital. So the sense that, I guess, women's rights was co-opted and sort of used in marketing and used in these ways to generate, like a new market, essentially. And I'll talk a bit about that later as well. And that's something that impacts the characters in the piece. And then very specifically, at the same, going back to the historical town, there was a legal case brought about by the Nisga'a Nation against the Amex Corporation for dumping mile tailings into the inlet. And I kind of did some archival research about this as well, and this also informs the narrative. So the idea of extraction, its impact on the environment, and its connection to colonialism is also very much present in the work. So all these sort of historical elements in the work itself, they sort of, I almost quote them in terms of the television. So there's a lot of TVs in the piece. When I play an excerpt, you'll see. And in the TVs, what the characters are watching make reference to these specific historical moments. So there's this really funny commercial that has to do with, in the 1980s, this image of women. Well, now women, they can do it all. They can work, they can be the perfect housewife, but they can also be really sexy. And the way that this image gets used in these commercials is really quite funny. And this will be one element that I'll reference in TVs. And then also the Islamic Revolution, this case with the Nisga'a Nation, the idea of the Cold War. So all these kind of historical moments will pop in as quotes and references on the televisions and the set. Now for the main story, the main narrative revolves around these 4 female characters that inhabit the town, and they're all sort of quote unquote wives of the workers in the mine, and they provide the unpaid reproductive and domestic labor that is usually left out of whenever people talk about the economy. The unpaid labor is always that invisible labor, reproductive labor, domestic labor. So within this piece, the plot appropriates the tropes of a horror film, but again, the idea of agency, what is that evil thing within a horror narrative, that is kind of turned on its head. So like a kind of classic Hollywood film, there are 2 turning points in the script. And the first turning point is when all these women kind of come together and they have a party just to meet each other. And a woman who's been living there a really long time, a local woman, channels a spirit that prophesizes the destruction of the town. So once these women experience that prophetic moment, they're shaken, and 4 different characters kind of start to speculate about what the cause of this, devastation is going to be. And their narratives, the individual narratives that these women pursue, have more to do with those conventional horror tropes. But what they fail to recognize that it's not these conventional horror tropes, although they're true. It's not that they're not true, but they are true, but they're not the things that are going to cause the demise of this town. It's actually the financial market. So the characters themselves are really important and central to the piece, and kind of modeled on different characters in horror films from the moment, but also they each have a sort of different relationship to the economy in relation to being, a woman in the late 1970s. So one of the characters, so I'll just kind of quickly go through the different characters. So one character is a journalist who kind of gave up her career to move to the town. And for her, the story or narrative she pursues in terms of why the town is going to be destroyed is she becomes convinced that the town is doomed because what they mine there is used to make weapons. And so that the destruction of the town is a kind of moral punishment because they're implicated in all the deaths that these weapons will produce. So with her, and the second plot point is that she disappears. And, the final denouement has to do with what happens to her. So that's one of the narratives is pursued. She has an older sister, and with the older sister, she's very skeptical. So she doesn't really believe in the prediction of destruction until her sister disappears. That's when she starts to take things seriously. And with this character, I really wanted to model her on Foucault's idea of the entrepreneurial self. So she's someone who really measures everything in terms of wins and losses and gains and losses, and is very no nonsense and is always looking for the value in things, and that monetary value and other kinds of value are really mixed up together for this character. The next character is Jess, and she's more of a kind of modeled on a hippie, quote unquote. And, she's really excited about being immersed in nature in this new town, not exactly maybe perceiving that, well, it's also an extraction town. But with her narrative, she starts to believe that the town is doomed because the company is maliciously polluting the water supply, and it's a kind of conspiracy. So this is another kind of trope that is implicated. So her narrative, her idea of why the town is going to be destroyed is ecological devastation. And then there's Sherry, and she's a woman of Iranian heritage who's married a North American. And for her, she's got a deep longing to create community. So this is her driving element. So a kind of real investment in the idea of the town as a model community and a home space, despite her own journey of migration, or because of her own journey with migration. So she is the one who really initiates the seance. She has a lot at stake in it, and her story is more the conventional horror ghost story, where she becomes convinced that the vengeful ghost of a murdered woman, a woman prospector from the early days of the town, is going to be the cause of the town's ruin. So she brings that other element of the horror story. So all of these women sort of throughout the narrative, chase their own concept of why they think the town is going to be destroyed. And in the end, they're all sort of proven that's not, although they're all right, and all the things that they believe and uncover and speculate about are happening, they aren't actually the cause of the ruin of the town. So finally, the last character is the woman who initiates the seance. She's a spiritual consultant, and she's actually someone who's been living in that community since the previous boom and bust cycle. So Kitsault itself, the historical town, just like many other extraction towns, has these boom and bust cycles that have repeated. And so the story with her is that, there was another previous boom and bust, and, she was raised in this town, and then she decided to stay. And she's sort of witnessing the kind of beginning of another cycle of development and reinvestment and all that kind of stuff. So that's that character over there. So going on from that, I'll talk a little bit about my process to date, and then I'll play a little excerpt for you of what it's looking like. So this project has been, I've been working on it for a good chunk of time, and I started script writing and pre-production in 2018, and I did a residency in New York for 3 months, and that's where I developed the set, the model, all the the script and the storyboard and all that stuff. And then I sort of got the funding in 2020, but then of course we went into COVID and lockdown. So production happened in 2021, and currently I'm in post-production. So that's where I'm sort of working on the editing, the effects, and sound. So during my time here, I've gotten pretty close to locking down the final edit of the piece. So the edit that, you know, takes into account the synchronization between all the different screens. And yeah, ready to move on to the effects. So maybe now I'll go ahead and play a little bit of an excerpt. So the excerpt, just get out of that for a second. The excerpt is, will have a lot of these green spaces. So there's space to sort of imagine what's going to be in those green spaces. Typically, what will be in those green spaces are either mine or architecture, the environment, whereas a lot of the actual shot footage is the interiors and the narrative elements. Also, what's interesting about, and this is something that I'm trying to develop and work on here as well, what's interesting about working with this project is when I have it all like that with all the screens in front of me, I'm really forced to think about the relationships between the screens, but it's hard for me to always remember that you're never going to see all the screens at once. So when I'm editing it like this and how you'll see it now, you'll see all the screens at once, but we have to think about or imagine that within the set, you would actually not see all of it at once. You would walk and see some of it. You might hear a little bit behind you. So they would be kind of more, constructed in a 3D space. So this is just a final note I'll say, and then I'll play these really short excerpts. It's only narrative-wise, I only have, it's only until like the first turning point, the seance, but I'm not showing all of the scenes, just a little bit to give you a sense of how the narratives will happen, how there will be kind of simultaneous narratives happening at once, and how, although there's all these screens, there's not always going to be a narrative unfolding on each one. Sometimes the screens will function more as background or as sort of a kind of material, reminding us, almost like props, where they remind us of the time period through invocations of materials. So yeah, anyway, I'll play it and then we can talk about it, and I can take any questions. So I will share that. Sorry, I just want to make sure. Yeah, there we go.
For people here, this will become a model town, a model community for the long term.
This is the house from our living room. How did you get it?
I can't wait to go
His dad gave it to me when we were packing up mom's stuff. It's Italian. It's probably worth something now.
Look at that house. It looks so much older than anything else around here.
It sure does. I thought no one else lived here before we arrived.
I wonder if it's deserted.
I understand what you mean about the safety, though. I thought, wouldn't it be great to just remove her from all of the dangers of the city and immerse her in nature? It's funny, we fought so hard to be able to work how we wanted and go where we wanted and love how we wanted. We still only do those things under threat.
I'm going out tonight.
got time
Where
to
you
fight
going?
for anything.
Who's that?
I guess we're invading your solitude. A little bit. But I usually have company.
Are you married, Lydia?
No, never married.
She may live all the way out here, but she has been to anywhere you might imagine.
I travel quite a bit.
Tell the girls what you do.
I don't think so. Some people don't approve. Now you have to tell us. They sense a question. A question that encircles us and dances within the circle. But before the question can be answered, it must be asked. Who will ask the question?
Yeah, that's it. So just a short little excerpts from the work. And I think I would love to hear questions or feedback at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matilda, for such a wonderful talk. I've been waiting to hear more from you because every time I go to the studio, for folks who are watching, Matilda, the background is like all your storyboards, and so I'm like, oh, what's brewing? So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And yeah, reminder for everyone who's watching that now it's the time to start typing your questions in the Q&A box, which is like just down on your screen. And before we start reading all these questions, I maybe want to start asking you about something you mentioned earlier, and hoping this could be generative for the conversation. You mentioned the evil agency of horror films, and in this case, the market having that evil agency. And then you also mentioned how with this museum exhibit you have in mind, or like a theme park attraction where people are able to like come in and sort of be the own editors of the story. Like, can you like talk about maybe like that connection between like the evil agency and then the agency of the audience to edit the story?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think sometimes all these sort of layers, I feel like sometimes I have so many layers that I kind of forget what's there. But I would say, in a sense, I think that the evil agency, or the idea of evil that's divorced from a specific kind of centralized agency, whether it's a human centralized agency or, like, so an individual, or some kind of identifiable supernatural agency. Once we kind of move out from there, it's really hard to think about agency and in specifically evil agency. So there's a difficulty in accessing that idea, accessing what we could maybe talk about as the whole of that idea. And so I think the difficulty of that access, that you're always missing part of the picture, is kind of reflected in the narrative of the set, and that you're never going to get the total picture. I mean, if really, it's already kind of turning into something quite long. It's about 40 minutes now. I may have to cut it down. So if you were to actually want to get like every scene, every shot, every experience, every aspect of the narrative, it would be a huge investment, which maybe goes back to like maybe the investment that we need to put in thinking about negative agency in the world. So that's how I think the form and content are connected in this instance, is that the thing evokes the whole, but it also evokes the complexity of the whole that it's very hard to unravel. It's very hard to access. You will feel it in terms of affect, because the way I've scripted it, the arc of the story is the same. So the optimism of everyone moving in happens on one time. The turning points happen across the screen at the other times, but at the same time, each character is living their own kind of version of it. And that is what is difficult to access. Yeah.
I really like the formal, Lisa asked a question, I will get to her, but I need to know when formally it's like the way you are arranging the space for people to come in and discover the story. I find it to be an invitation for people to also be like the researchers and like actively become part of the story. So I'm just so excited about this project when I see in person. Like what is that invitation about? Is this something that you bring into your practice?
I love that. I love that idea. I mean, I haven't ever thought about it this way, but it is like that, because there's so many layers. Like even if we look at this historical town, you know, it was, you know, kind of representative of that period, but also these issues around sort of pollution and the struggle of Indigenous folks against these big corporations, something that certainly I, growing up like in primary school in the 80s, was not aware of, nor was it ever on TV in a way that was, you know, kind of pervasive. So there's that layer that's in there. So absolutely, I love the idea that people are going to dig into it. And in a way, for me, the TV is that. It's like the primary sources. I mean, that's a stretch, but there's a way in which that documentary footage on the TVs is part of it. But then also each of the characters are living a strand of it. So whether, you know, worried about ecological what's going on, whereas the other one, you know, worried about, and even the ghost is sort of based on, you know, these women prospectors who they existed, and they had these sort of kind of, I modeled it on one character who did take, you know, her claims were stolen, and she took the people into court and all that stuff. So they're all kind of based on these little known histories around the space. Also, just like every other kind of economic body, Amex Corporation, you know, is connected to the slave trade, you know, way back when, you know, so there's all these layers. So I love the idea that the viewer would be a researcher of sorts. But at the same time, there's that kind of cerebral research element, but then there's also the affect. And I'm really interested in kind of creating a sense of pathos or dread or all those things that come with the genre of horror. I don't know if I'll get there. We'll see, you know, because it is so formally split. I'm still not at that stage where I know whether like the chase scene will feel the same as a chase scene in horror. Probably not, but I'm interested to see. I think there's a part of it where I won't know until it's spatialized how those affective elements will work. So that's going to be a bit of a mystery, I guess.
Yeah, oh my God. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer my questions. We have many coming up now. I'm going to start with Lisa. Lisa is commenting on the chat box, so you can read it there, but I have to read it out loud for captioning purposes and for everyone who's listening to hear. So Lisa's asking, just a practical question. Is there any randomness to how the edits operate, or all of them choreographed to unfold in a specific sequence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, there is no randomness. So it's all choreographed, kind of, again, like a film or a classical film. It's just that they're kind of torn apart. So yeah, and that's been really the tricky part, is sort of figuring out how they're going to interact with one another. And something that I planned from the get-go, right? And given the way the piece is, it's really hard to make those changes, but I've made a little bit of changes, but that's sort of where that storyboard comes in, and that I really thought about what I wanted to put next to what from the beginning. So the randomness maybe comes in that accumulation of background and material, but it still won't be random in the structural sense. It's just going to be more spontaneous in terms of what I will pick to put on the sets that are not actively, part of the narrative unfolding, but are more sort of background or ambiance or stuff like that. So, yeah, not random.
And connecting to the storyboards, Amy is asking, saying first, this is such a fascinating work. Will it be possible to get a closer look at any of the storyboarding process on the wall?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can absolutely take you over and show you a little bit. So this is how I storyboarded, and really, it's the first time that I have seen them up like this, but I sort of storyboarded in a way where for each shot, like I had to kind of think about what's going on this screen. So the temporal element is through the flipbook element. So that's sort of doing the conventional storyboarding of what comes after what, and depending on which screen, like what's visible. So that's time. And then spatially, so you'll see that some things hold, like this background landscape holds for a long time while things are happening over here, for example. And then a big jump in time is next to the next shot, for example. But yeah, it was really hard to shoot all this. So I did have to generate, I think I have a copy somewhere of I had to generate a whole new one for actual filming to make it clearer, but I don't think anybody in the crew actually really engaged in like trying to understand it. It was too complex. So yeah, I mean, I guess I can talk a bit about the process, but it was more like thinking about strands of storyboarding. And using that flipbook methodology. So when I wasn't quite ready to move to the whole next shot, I would just have like, little frame changes or shot changes within the larger unit of the whole quote unquote shot, and then jump to the next. So it was a combination of like spatialized, imagining and also temporal on top of each other.
Yeah, and for what I'm hearing and seeing, there has been many iterations of that reimagining and specialization of the narratives and the characters. And something that Colleen Miller is asking here is, like, what's the difference? Like, you've been working on this project for quite a bit of time. So Colleen is asking, you've pulled together so many fascinating themes to get to this solid work. I'm wondering how these ideas grew through the years, and did contemporary news nudge to work in a different direction?
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, it's funny. The kind of research phase really happened in 2018, so that I had to break it up. So it was in 2018 during that residency. I had a 3-month residency in New York where I did the script and kind of figuring out like who is doing what at what time. That sort of went, was embedded in the script. And that's when I did a lot of the research. So as contemporary things happened, first of all, the pandemic happened, and I was like, oh my God, this doesn't account for the pandemic, but then now when now with the whole Russian invasion, sort of emergence of once again thinking about Cold War narratives, the reemergence or the rebranding of Cold War narratives, but also narratives around fascism. I was like, wow, okay, so it resonated for me. I mean, in a way that if I had been in the research phase when it happened, I would have incorporated it more, but I didn't. So I kind of had to cut it off. But I've been thinking a lot about it and how it connects. And I think, those ideas will impact perhaps the stuff that remains to be done, which is the effects. But yeah, I've been intellectually having a conversation with that, but I haven't changed anything in the actual piece. And I think that that is an element of the way I work, is that I have to lock things down at some point to move on to the next stage. And I can't go back, because that means like I have to redo way too much. And now that we've shot it, like that's locked in, and I can't go back. But there's still space in the stuff that remains to be seen. And a lot will happen in the sound as well. But also in the effects, like sort of like my resort work, there will be moments in the piece. So within the piece, one thing I didn't talk about is that each of the three characters will have, there's a dream sequence that goes with each of the three characters. One has this vision of bomb and destruction, and that will be using a lot of found footage in the style of my previous projects. And in that, I'm kind of ahistorical, like I will be sourcing material from all kinds of moments. And then there'll also be one about environmental devastation. That's the dream vision of one of the other characters. And then finally, the one with the ghost. And that will focus more on archival photos of the old mining town. Actually, there was in Kitsault, right next to it, there was another mine called Dolly Varden. And so I'm going to be sourcing those images. So there will be moments where I'll have more freedom to integrate more stuff that's happened since. But yeah, like long story short is that I do have to lock it down. So although it hasn't changed things, it definitely changes my way of thinking about it moving forward.
Yeah, of course. And well, first of all, just a reminder to everyone who's watching, if you have any questions, please start typing away. And it disconnects so like just greatly with Lindsay's questions, also the Q&A box, because it's about like how do you part with this, like how are you okay with this, like stories, like what people take away from them? So I'm just gonna read it for you. So Lindsay says, this is such an exciting form of expanded narrative. You mentioned thinking about relating it to conventional narrative structure. How do you imagine handling the relationship between time, timing, editing, and the experience of a viewer in the space? What they are capable or might choose to pay attention to? Will you need to create connecting or suturing scenes that don't have critical content in them to ensure viewers experience these stories, which will make it longer? Or are you happy with the idea that people may not take in all of the stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really where I'm at right now. So there was a bit of frustration with me because as I was putting it together, I was like, actually, there are a lot of these scenes where because I originally thought, I mean, there's 6 screens, but there's only ever 2 to sometimes more, sometimes we get up to 4, but a lot of times there's only like 2 narratives happening at once or 2 sort of dialogue oriented narratives happening at once. So when I was doing it, I was like, oh, there's only 2 things happening, but then I have to generate all this like stuff on the other screens, right? So there is a way in which I'm negotiating how time passes and how, there will be moments, I think, that when people in the audience hear dialogue, they will wander to where they hear it because what might be in front of them might be, just more landscape or more sort of ambiance. So negotiating that. I mean, in terms of to answer another part of your question, I am comfortable with people not getting the whole thing, I think, but there are scenes. So there's that seance moment, and so sometimes I shift gears. So when it's a moment where it's really, really important. And I think there's 2 seances that happen. And those are the 2 moments where actually all the screens start to show just different views or different of the same narrative moment. So I cheat a little bit in that way. So there is this tension between like the classical narrative and the more expanded and fragmented narrative where, the kind of place in the narrative is the same. So opening is all about optimism and then, different strands within that optimism, hopes and dream stuff. And then there's that seance scene where, yes, as a viewer, you will absolutely get that scene because wherever you go, you'll see it just from a different perspective. And then we go to like each one doing their inquiry, and that's on different scenes. So the viewer might just get one inquiry, not the others, or aspects of one and aspects of the other. But then again, like towards the end, there'll be a scene where, it's unified. So I'm kind of moving between this kind of freedom for the viewer and more constraint for the viewer in the piece in order to serve the narrative. So it is this kind of back and forth. And And yeah, and it has been like kind of kind of intuitively, but also sometimes more explicitly thinking about that connection between the classical narrative arc and a more expanded arc, and how I'm not comfortable, kind of to go back to Lisa's question, I don't want a kind of total randomness and total freedom. But at the same time, I do want some freedom and multiplicity built in. So kind of how to negotiate those two things. And the reason I don't want total freedom is because I do want the kind of being swept up in it that comes with a classical narrative. And I want that element to still be moving the viewer. So it's not just an exercise in research, but it's an exercise in research, but also, being swept up in the narrative. So it's like those two things simultaneously. And again, I kind of won't know what will happen or how it'll come together until it's done in a way and staged.
Yeah, let me just, we have one more question from Lisa. I'll just quickly mention Colleen's comment again, which I think nicely wraps up what you just discussed, which is Colleen says, thank you, that's interesting, but it's not locked down in what is stimulated in the viewer, especially as the ideas are so rich. And lastly, Lisa's asking, that's in the chat box, I'll just read it aloud. So it says, I am really interested in how the ghost as a concept functions in relation to the turning point in the film, knowing it is part of the horror genre, but also the idea of hunting in relation to your concept. Can you speak to this a bit more?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And when I was researching, I did a lot of like reading into hauntology. And even just recently, I read Arundhati Roy's really great Capitalism, A Ghost Story. So this idea of the connection between haunting and capitalism has sort of been in my mind for a long time. And so, yeah, the idea of the ghost in the turning point of the film is really interesting, because I think for me, the ghost, I think at least one of the characters really does think that the ghost is the woman's a murdered woman's ghost, which is that kind of conventional narrative in many ways, which often it will be very personalized, right? And in the context of a horror film, and then you will have to sort of extrapolate the sociopolitical from that personalized individual story of the one ghost. But what I start to intimate towards the end is that like actually that ghost is capital. So what the seance lady is channeling is capital. So that's what the ghost is. So yeah, there's lots of connections between the idea of haunting and capital. I mean, that's central. Even the fact that this is an actual ghost town, right? And the idea of a ghost town. And originally I did really want to shoot in that town, but I mean, a whole other really interesting story is that it's owned by this very, wealthy businessman now doesn't really know what he wants to do with it. But he definitely knows he doesn't want people to film in it. So I was really interested. Yeah. So it's really I had a conversation with him at the very beginning. My original idea was to actually restage things within that town, but that was not a possibility. And so I had to like kind of create this other town, which also I think did free me up to bring in all these other elements. But yeah, so I do think that even the town itself is really sort of a haunted site in that way. Yeah. Great question.
And my speculative brain is like, why is he hiding? What's in there?
Yeah. Well, visit and I was going to go but it's the only way to really visit it is there's this one fellow who has built a really good relationship with whoever is there, and he does these tours So you can go in and you can stay in one of the apartments. And I was going to do that during COVID, but again, then COVID happened. I didn't do it. And I got, caught up in other things. So you can visit the place. I will eventually go, but now I'm really torn about whether I want to see it before it's finished, or I want this to be a separate thing, and then I'll go see it. But it is visitable. So there's these tours that go overnight from Terrace, BC. So it's quite up north. You have to get to Terrace and then go. So you can go, and it is still maintained. But yeah, and I do think it was used as a film site previously, but but not currently. And who knows, that might change. And the story of this individual businessman is really interesting too. But I was like, I can't expand it that far, maybe one day, but I'd like to move on to other things at some point too.
Okay, well, we'll wait for the sequel and
part 2. Yeah.
But thank you so much for that wonderful project presentation, your generosity in answering all these questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.